Jeff Beck was
work,
known for
and
two
Jeff
things
was in
above all
bands,
else,
and then Jeff was
working
in the
on his
Yardbirds,
cars and playing
and
guitar.
I was in the Yardbirds
There
with
wasn't
Jeff.
much middle ground for him between these two passions. In the world of guitar legends, few musicians commanded as much respect and fear as Jeff Beck did. He was an innovative master who changed how rock guitar was played, pushing the limits of what could be done with 6 strings. However, Beck wasn't just a technical genius who revolutionized guitar playing. He was also famously difficult to work with, a perfectionist with impossibly high standards and a fierce temper that made him one of the most disliked musicians among his fellow artists. Behind all his groundbreaking solos and genre-changing experimentation was a man who had zero patience for anything less than perfect. He possessed a sharp tongue that could end careers with just one harsh comment. Beck didn't simply dislike certain ways of making music. He actively hated what he saw as lazy playing, and musicians who sold out their artistic values for fame and money. The guitar wizard from Surrey, England, who created classics like Blow by Blow and Wired, had a well-known reputation for destroying relationships with other musicians. Throughout his career, Beck built up quite a list of enemies that included some of the biggest names in rock music. These weren't just simple creative disagreements or professional conflicts. These were deep, personal grudges that lasted for decades and shaped how competitive rock guitar became. Here are the 5 legendary musicians who reportedly couldn't stand Jeff Beck and everything he represented. Rod Stewart. The partnership that exploded. Rod Stewart, the raspy-voiced superstar who became one of rock's biggest entertainers, developed a bitter hatred for Jeff Beck that started during their explosive time working together in the Jeff Beck group in the late 1960s, the Probo Azul. EMS reportedly began during the recording of their album Truth in 1968, when Beck's perfectionist demands clashed with Stewart's more relaxed way of making music. Rock journalist Chris Welch reported that Stewart told session musicians that Beck thought every single note had to be perfect, but he forgot that rock and roll was supposed to have soul. Stewart felt that Beck had turned music into a mathematics test rather than an emotional expression. What really made Stewart angry was Beck's controlling behavior in the studio and on stage. While Stewart wanted to develop his own stage presence and singing style, Beck was treating him like just another backup musician in his band. People in the music industry said this led to explosive arguments about creative direction and who got top billing. The final breaking point came during their 1969 American tour, when Beck criticized Stewart's stage performance in front of the other band members, leading to a backstage fight. Witnesses said Stewart stormed out, telling Beck that he didn't need a guitar teacher who thought he was God, and that Beck should find himself another puppet. The aftermath was devastating for both their careers in the short term. Stewart spent years publicly dismissing their collaboration, telling journalists that working with Beck was like being in a band with a musical dictator who crushed everyone's creativity. For Stewart, Beck had turned what should have been a creative partnership into a master-servant relationship, making their split one of rock's most bitter breakups. Eric Clapton, the blues purist versus the experimenter. Eric Clapton, the blues purist once called God by his fans, reportedly held deep resentment toward Jeff Beck that lasted for decades. This bad blood was fueled by professional jealousy and what Clapton saw as Beck's pretentious abandonment of blues tradition in favor of experiment. Showing off. The problem started in the mid-1960s when both guitarists were emerging from the British blues scene. Music historian John Mayall reported that Clapton told fellow musicians that Beck had the technique but had lost the soul. He said Beck was treating the guitar like a science experiment instead of an instrument of emotion, and that real blues comes from suffering, not from a laboratory. What made this rivalry particularly intense was their competing claims to guitar supremacy. While Clapton built his reputation on faithful interpretations of American blues masters, Beck was gaining acclaim with what Clapton called circus tricks, innovative techniques that, in Clapton's traditionalist view, sacrificed emotional authenticity for technical flash. The tension reached its peak during a 1975 recording session where both guitarists were present. Industry witnesses said Clapton walked out when Beck began demonstrating his latest experimental techniques, muttering that he came there to play music, not watch a magic show. The feud continued for years, with both guitarists taking subtle shots at each other in interviews. Clapton maintained that Beck had forgotten why the guitar was invented, while Beck dismissed Clapton as a museum curator who was afraid to push boundaries. Their rivalry represented a fundamental split in guitar philosophy: tradition versus innovation, emotion versus technique, blues purity versus experimental fusion. For these two giants, there was no middle ground. Jimmy Page. The Yardbirds competition. Jimmy Page, the mystical mastermind behind Led Zeppelin's thunderous sound, developed an intense dislike for Jeff Beck that stemmed from their shared history in the Yardbirds and what Page saw as Beck's arrogant dismissal of anyone he considered beneath his technical standards. The animosity began during their overlapping time in the Yardbirds, where both guitarists competed for the lead role. Rock historian Greg Russo reported that Page told session musicians that Beck thought being technically superior gave him the right to look down on everyone else. Page felt that Beck had confused skill with wisdom, and it had made him insufferable to work with. What particularly bothered Page was Beck's attitude toward collaborative music making. While Page believed in serving the song and working as part of a team, Beck was treating every musical situation as an opportunity to demonstrate his individual brilliance. The conflict exploded during a 1966 recording session where Beck criticized Page's playing in front of other musicians, leading to a heated exchange about musical priorities. Witnesses said Page stormed out, telling Beck that he would rather play with musicians who understood that ego should serve music, not the other way around. The rivalry continued, even after both achieved superstar status with their respective bands. Page told friends that Beck had the talent of a genius, but the attitude of a spoiled child, while industry veterans said Page deliberately avoided projects where Beck might be involved. For the Led Zeppelin architect, Beck represented everything toxic about musical virtuosity without humility, making their relationship impossible to repair. Keith Richards, raw power versus clinical perfection. Keith Richards, the immortal Rolling Stones guitarist and keeper of rock's rebellious spirit, reportedly despised Jeff Beck for what he saw as the complete opposite of everything rock and roll should represent: raw passion replaced by clinical perfection. The hatred began in the early 1970s when both guitarists were at the height of their powers, but pursuing completely different musical directions. Rolling Stone journalist Robert Greenfield reported that Richards told drinking companions that Beck had turned rock guitar into a science experiment. He said Beck was so busy showing off his technique that he had forgotten raw Turin. Rock and roll was supposed to come from the guts, not from a practice room. What made Richards furious was Beck's approach to live performance and recording. While Richards embodied rock's dangerous, unpredictable energy through raw power and streetwise attitude, Beck was gaining acclaim with what Richards called conservatory rock, highly polished performances that prioritized technical excellence over emotional authenticity. The animosity came to a head during a 1973 London recording session where both guitarists were present. Industry witnesses said Richards made deliberately provocative comments about guitar players who think they're in an orchestra, leading Beck to respond that some musicians prefer precision to sloppiness. The exchange escalated until both men left the studio. Richards' contempt wasn't just about musical style, it was cultural warfare about rock's soul. He saw Beck as representing rock's intellectualization, turning a working-class art form into middle-class entertainment. For the ultimate rock outlaw, Beck had committed the unforgivable sin of making rock music safe, predictable, and emotionally sterile. The Stones guitarist told friends that Beck represented everything wrong with modern guitar playing: all technique and no heart, all flash and no substance. Ritchie Blackmore, the ultimate ego clash. Ritchie Blackmore, the theatrical mastermind behind Deep Purple and Rainbow, reportedly had the most intense hatred for Jeff Beck. This feud represented the ultimate clash of guitar egos that defined an entire era of rock rivalry. The feud's roots traced back to the late 1960s British guitar scene, where both players were establishing their reputations. Rock journalist Jeff Barton reported that Blackmore told session musicians that Beck thought his technique made him superior to everyone else, but he had forgotten that music was supposed to move people, not impress them. Blackmore said Beck had turned the guitar into a computer that happened to have strings. What made Blackmore's hatred particularly intense was Beck's alleged dismissiveness toward other guitarists' approaches. While Blackmore was developing his own theatrical style, combining classical influences with heavy rock, Beck was making condescending comments about guitarists who relied on gimmicks rather than pure technique. The animosity exploded during a 1971 recording session where Beck criticized Blackmore's use of classical elements in rock music, calling it musical theater for people who couldn't handle real innovation. Industry witnesses said Blackmore responded by walking out, telling studio engineers that he didn't take musical advice from someone who had confused showing off with artistic expression. The rivalry continued for decades, with both guitarists taking shots at each other in interviews. Blackmore maintained that Beck was technically brilliant but musically soulless, while sources said he deliberately avoided any projects where Beck might be involved. For Blackmore, Beck represented the worst aspects of musical elitism, technical perfection without emotional connection, making their feud a battle between heart and mind that neither could win. Industry insiders said the hatred was so intense that Blackmore would refuse to discuss Beck in interviews, calling him a machine pretending to be a musician. These 5 rivalries show how Jeff Beck's perfectionist attitude and dismissive behavior toward fellow musicians created lasting enemies throughout his career. While his technical brilliance was undeniable, his inability to work collaboratively with others led to some of rock music's most bitter and long-lasting feuds.